They knock softly, at midnight during storms, on birthdays, always with one question: "Can we come in?" Behind their soaked smiles or innocent voices are curses, lost souls, ancient deals, and things that should never speak in a child's tone. From crumbling suburbs to forgotten orphanages, 10 stories unravel a horrifying truth. The knock is never just a knock. If you open the door, you may never close it again. These aren't just ghost stories. They're warnings. And tonight, the children are knocking. There's something about the sound of a child knocking on a door that feels harmless, gentle, even sweet. But what if that knock comes at 3 a.m.? What if the child is soaking wet, smiling with dead eyes? What if, when you open the door, they simply whisper, "You've been invited? Welcome to Children Who Knock." A terrifying collection of 10 original horror stories that take one simple concept and turn it into your next sleepless night. Each tale explores a different scenario, some urban, some rural, all disturbingly close to home, where children, or things that wear their shape, appear on doorsteps with chilling intent. From cursed doors and sentient rain to eldritch invitations and twisted TikTok challenges, every story builds on the last, showing that some knocks are better left unanswered. Meet protagonists like Claire, Leonard, Maxine, and Elijah, each facing their own nightmare, each fighting forces that feed on innocence, memory, guilt, and grief. And always, the knocking returns. This isn't just horror, it's folklore reborn. It's myth woven into the mundane. And it's going to make you think twice the next time you hear a soft knock at your door. Ready to hear them all? Story number 1. The moon hung low over Willow Creek, casting long shadows on the quiet suburban street where Claire Martinez lived with her 8-year-old daughter, Lily. The neighborhood was the kind that looked straight out of a 1950s sitcom. Perfectly manicured lawns, white picket fences, and houses that seemed untouched by time. But tonight, something felt wrong. Claire stood at the window, her eyes darting over the street. The calmness outside only seemed to heighten the unease that gnawed at her. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling for days now. A feeling that something was lurking, just beyond her reach. Something dark and impossible to explain. And then, at precisely 3 a.m., it happened again. A knock at the door. It was quiet at first, almost like a tap on the wood. Then, more insistently, 3 sharp raps. Claire's heart skipped in her chest. Who would be out there at this hour? She glanced over at Lily, fast asleep in her bed, her small chest rising and falling rhythmically. Reluctantly, Claire pulled herself away from the window. She crept down the hallway, her bare feet silent against the cool wooden floor. Another knock. She reached the door, her hand on the doorknob. There was something strange about the way the knocks came. So methodical, so precise. Through the peephole, she saw them. Children, pale as if drained of color, their eyes wide and eerily calm. They wore old-fashioned clothes, too old for the modern-day world, with dirty hems and shoes that didn't match. There were 5 of them, standing in perfect silence, their eyes locked on the door, waiting. Claire's hand froze on the knob. She swallowed hard, feeling her pulse quicken. She wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or anything supernatural, but this felt wrong. Wrong in a way that she couldn't put into words. She took a deep breath and spoke through the door, trying to sound confident, even though her voice shook slightly. "Go home. It's too late for you to be out here." The children didn't answer. They simply stared, their expressions blank, their bodies unmoving. A strange chill filled the air around her, as if the very atmosphere had thickened. Another knock, and then another. Her heart raced as she backed away from the door. She reached for the phone, dialing the number for the local police, but the line went dead as soon as she pressed the last digit. Panic clawed at her throat. What was happening? Why was no one else awake? Suddenly, the knocking stopped. Claire's eyes flicked back to the window, and she saw the children slowly turn and walk away, disappearing into the darkness of the street. The next morning, Claire couldn't shake the feeling of dread. She didn't tell Lily, of course. Lily would never understand, not with her innocent eyes and trust in the world. But Claire couldn't stop thinking about those children, about the way they looked, their pale faces, and the way they stared at her as if waiting for something. When Claire took Lily to school, she noticed something strange. The neighbor's house across the street, the one with the family of 4, was eerily quiet. No one was outside. No cars in the driveway. No sign of life. Later that day, Mrs. Harrow, the elderly neighbor who lived next door to Claire, came over to chat, a cup of tea in her hands. She had been around long enough to know the neighborhood's history. "Did you hear about the Jenkins family?" Mrs. Harrow asked, her voice a whisper. "They disappeared overnight, just like the others." "What do you mean, disappeared?" Claire asked, trying to keep her tone light. Mrs. Harrow lowered her voice. "There's been a lot of strange things happening in this town, Claire. People don't like to talk about it. But there's something about this place. Something that's been here longer than we know. The orphanage." "The orphanage?" Claire repeated, confused. "What orphanage?" Mrs. Harrow looked over her shoulder, making sure no one was listening. "It stood where our neighborhood is now, before the houses went up. I heard stories from people who were around back then. The children from that orphanage. They made a pact. A terrible pact. They were trying to summon something. Something evil." Claire felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Summon what?" "That's the thing," Mrs. Harrow whispered. "No one knows for sure. But after the orphanage burned down, there were rumors. Rumors that the spirits of those children are still here. They made a deal, you see, with something dark. A demon, maybe. And now, every few years the children come back. They need replacements. That night, it happened again. 3 a.m., the knock on the door. This time, Claire didn't even look through the peephole. She already knew who it was, but this time, something was different. Lily was awake. "Mom?" Lily whispered from the doorway of her bedroom. Claire turned to find her daughter standing there, her small figure bathed in the pale light of the moon. "Mom, who's at the door?" Claire's heart sank. Lily's voice was hollow, her eyes distant. "Lily?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. "What did you say?" Lily blinked, her gaze unfocused. "They said we have to let them in. They said they want to play with me." Claire's breath hitched. The child at the door wasn't just asking to come in. It was an invitation. They were trying to get to her daughter, to take her. The realization hit Claire like a brick. These children weren't alive. They were spirits, trapped in a cycle, doomed to seek replacements for their own doomed pact. And Lily was their next target. "Stay here," Claire ordered, but her voice cracked. She wasn't sure she could keep her promise. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. The next day, Claire couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Lily was acting strange, murmuring in her sleep, walking around the house at night, her movements stiff and jerky. She was speaking in phrases that Claire didn't recognize, words that sounded like echoes of the pale children. Claire had to find a way to break the pact. She had to stop this. She went to the ruins of the orphanage, now nothing more than an overgrown field. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe an artifact or a clue, or a way to stop the spirits once and for all. But what she found was a small, crumbling journal. Its pages yellowed with age. The entries spoke of a ritual, a dark deal made with an ancient evil. The pact was made with the promise of eternal life in exchange for the souls of children. The only way to break it was to offer oneself in place of the child. And so, Claire made the hardest decision of her life. She returned home, locked the doors, and placed Lily in her bed. Then she waited. At 3 a.m., the knocking came. But this time, Claire didn't hesitate. She opened the door, and the pale children flooded in. Without a word, they swarmed around her, their cold, empty eyes meeting hers. Claire whispered a prayer to herself and stepped forward, offering her life to break the pact. The children reached for her, their hands icy cold, their faces twisted in eternal hunger. The next morning, there was no sign of Claire. Only Lily remained, standing at the edge of the street. Her eyes were wide and her pale face was expressionless. Exactly 3 a.m., Lily stepped forward and knocked on the door of a new family. The cycle had begun again. Story number 2. The small town of East Hollow had always been quiet. Tucked away from the chaos of the world, it had its share of old houses, fields that stretched on forever, and a sense of timelessness that never really seemed to change. The kind of place where you knew everyone's name, and their business too. But one evening, 5 teenagers stumbled into East Hollow with a plan that would shake the town's calm to its core. They had come to play a game, a viral TikTok challenge that everyone was talking about. Knock knock, who's there? The game was simple. A group of teens would wear creepy masks, knock on strangers' doors, and record their reactions. It was meant to be spooky, funny, harmless. But no one really knew how dangerous it could get. Dylan, the leader of the group, had suggested they try it. Come on, it'll be fun. Everyone's doing it. What's the worst that could happen? Jace Carter wasn't so sure. He'd always been the one to question things. He didn't like the idea of scaring random people for laughs, especially not in a town that already felt like it was stuck in the past. But Dylan was persuasive, and the others, Mara, Ty, and Dylan's girlfriend Allison, weren't exactly backing out. Are you in or not? Dylan pressed, holding up his phone to record. It's gonna blow up on TikTok. We'll be legends. Jace hesitated. He was never one to follow the crowd, but there was something about the way Dylan spoke. Like this challenge was the key to something bigger, something they'd all be part of. Reluctantly, Jace agreed. Fine, let's do it. But no messing around. The first few houses went exactly as they expected. There was the usual startled reaction, the nervous laughter, the occasional curse word from someone who didn't appreciate being woken at midnight. They wore masks that ranged from simple plastic, grins to grotesque, twisted faces. It was all fun and games until they reached the last house, the one at the end of the street. The house everyone in town whispered about. The house was old, cracked windows, a sagging porch, weeds crawling up the sides. It looked abandoned, except for the faint flicker of light from the upstairs window. No one ever seemed to see the people who lived there, but Jace had heard rumors. He'd heard that it was home to the Gentry family, people who'd lived there for generations, people who were strange. We're not going there, Jace said, suddenly uneasy. There's something wrong about that house? Ty snorted. Are you scared, man? This is the last one, and then we'll head back. Think about all the views we'll get." The others were already heading toward the front door. Dylan shot Jace a grin. "Come on, man. We're here. Let's finish it." Jace followed them, his heart pounding. As they got closer, a cold breeze blew across the porch, sending a shiver up his spine. He turned to Mara. "I don't like this." She raised an eyebrow. "What are you, chicken?" Before Jace could respond, Ty knocked on the door 3 times. The sound echoed through the quiet night. They waited. Nothing. And then a soft sound, the faintest scraping of a lock being undone. The door creaked open, revealing a small pale child standing in the doorway. The child's eyes were wide and vacant, like they were seeing something far beyond them. "Who's there?" the child asked, their voice far too soft for their size, too old-sounding for a kid, almost hollow. "Just a little prank, buddy," Dylan said, his voice more smug than friendly. "We just wanted to say—" But the words died in his throat when he saw the others standing behind the child. More children, dozens of them, standing in the shadow of the entryway. All of them looked like they were barely alive. Pale, thin, their faces frozen in blank expressions, their eyes too big for their faces. Too deep. Jace's stomach turned. Something wasn't right. "We should go," he said, backing away slowly, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind them. The air around them grew colder, and then the children began to move. They were fast, unnaturally fast, and before anyone could react, they were surrounded. Dylan tried to push his way through the swarm, but his eyes widened in shock when one of the children reached out and touched his arm. The touch was like ice, sending a jolt of fear straight through him. He stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What the hell is this?" The children didn't respond. Instead, they smiled, too wide, too empty, and slowly their faces began to change. Their features warped, shifting like wax in the heat until they looked like the teens themselves, like mirrors but distorted. The transformation happened quickly. One by one, they were taken. Mara was the first to fall, her screams cutting through the night as the children surrounded her, their mouths opening wider than humanly possible. They were feeding on her fear, draining it from her in sickening gulps. Ty went next, laughing nervously until his voice cracked and faltered, his face turning pale as the children mimicked his likeness and swallowed his essence. Allison cried, out, begging for her life. But the children weren't listening. And then there was Jace. He was still trying to make sense of everything, his mind racing as the children closed in on him. But something in him snapped. He couldn't fight them. He couldn't fight something that wasn't human. Instead, he ran. He bolted out of the yard, stumbling over his feet, and didn't stop until he was halfway down the street. The others were gone, their screams echoing in his mind. His heart hammered in his chest. Jace was the only one who made it out. He wasn't sure how he'd escaped. Maybe it was because he had stopped running when the others didn't. Maybe he had been spared because he didn't beg. Whatever the reason, he found himself standing in the middle of the road, his hands trembling, his body pale. He was still wearing the mask, but his face beneath it felt hollow. The next morning, the town was quiet again. The police would find the others eventually, but by then it wouldn't matter. The children had what they wanted. They would always get what they wanted. A week later, Jace found himself in another small town. Another quiet, sleepy place with nothing but rumors and gossip to fill the air. He didn't speak. He didn't feel anything. He just stood outside a house, waiting. He knocked. The door creaked open. The cycle was about to begin again. Story number 3. Thomas Leary had never intended to live in a cabin. But after his wife, Emily, passed away, everything changed. The life they had shared in the city, filled with laughter and art, felt like a distant memory, a world he could no longer return to. He needed to heal, to grieve in a place far away from the noise, the people, the memories. So he packed up his things, brought his young son, Sam, along, and moved to a remote cabin in the woods. The cabin wasn't much, just a small weathered building tucked between the trees. It had once been a hunting lodge, now long abandoned, by the locals, who all seemed to have their own reasons for staying away. But for Thomas, it was perfect, peaceful, quiet. At least that's what he thought at first. The first few nights were uneventful. He and Sam spent their days walking in the woods, fishing by the creek, or simply sitting in silence. Thomas could almost feel Emily's presence, like a shadow beside him. It hurt, but it also helped him feel connected to the life they had. Sam, of course, was the distraction Thomas needed. The boy was innocent, cheerful, unaware of the weight that pressed on his father's heart. But then, on the fourth night, the knocking began. It was quiet at first, just a tap, tap, tap on the door. Thomas had thought it was just a branch swaying against the wood, the wind playing tricks. But as the night wore on, it came again, more insistent this time. 3 knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. Tap, tap, tap. Thomas froze. "Sam," he whispered. But the boy was asleep, his soft breathing barely audible in the dim light of the room. Thomas stood up, his legs stiff as if the floorboards themselves were holding him in place. He walked to the door slowly, peering through the window. The porch was empty. There was nothing there. His mind raced. Was it an animal? A raccoon? But the knocking didn't make sense. It was deliberate. It was human. He opened the door, but no one was standing there. Nothing. For a moment, Thomas felt a chill seep into his bones, but he shrugged it off. It must have been the wind, or maybe the cabin settling. The night was full of strange sounds after all. He closed the door, locked it, and returned to his chair, trying to shake the feeling of unease crawling along his skin. The next night, the knocking came again, and the next. Each time, Thomas ignored it. Each time, the knocks were louder, more persistent. He had to face it. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what. And Sam didn't hear it. The boy seemed perfectly content, never waking, never noticing his father's growing tension. On the 5th night, Thomas decided he would answer. The knocking came at exactly midnight. 3 taps, then 2. He had no reason to be afraid. He was an adult. He was rational. But as he opened the door this time, he felt a heaviness in his chest, a cold that felt unnatural. At first, he saw nothing. The porch was still empty. And then, they appeared. 2 children, standing just outside the threshold. They were thin, their skin pale as moonlight, their eyes wide and empty. Their faces were expressionless, blank slates. The older of the 2, a girl, was dressed in a tattered, white dress, her hair falling in greasy strands around her face. The boy was younger, no more than 6, his clothes dirtied and ragged. His small hands were clasped tightly in front of him. "Can we come in?" the girl asked, her voice a soft rasp, like a breeze moving through dead leaves. Thomas stared at them, his mouth dry, his breath stuck in his chest. He didn't know what to do. The children didn't look threatening, but there was something wrong about them. Something off. Something that didn't belong. "No," he said, his voice hoarse. "You need to leave." The girl didn't respond. She only stepped forward, her feet dragging across the dirt, and entered the cabin. The boy followed her, his small feet making no sound on the wooden floor. They didn't speak, didn't ask for anything. They simply stood there, staring at Thomas with those wide, unblinking eyes. Sam stirred in his bed, but didn't wake. The room felt suddenly colder, the air thick, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. "What do you want?" Thomas whispered, but he already knew the answer. He had known it since the first knock. The girl's eyes flicked toward him and she smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was hollow. "We're here to play," she said, her voice echoing in his mind, a voice he recognized but couldn't place. For the first time in years, Thomas felt fear creep up his spine, a chill that seemed to reach down into his very soul. The children didn't leave. They never left. And from that moment on, the world around Thomas began to warp. Days blurred together. Hours stretched like taffy, pulling thin and weak. Thomas couldn't remember if it was morning or night anymore. His mind seemed to slip, like water draining through a hole, leaving only bits of half-formed thoughts. Sam was there, always there, except sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes Thomas would wake to find the boy standing at the window, staring out into the woods with a look that wasn't his own. Sometimes Sam would talk about things that hadn't happened yet, things that made no sense. "You remember when we went to the lake, Dad?" Sam would say, but Thomas had never taken him to a lake. Each time, Thomas tried to ask the children why they were there. They would remain silent, their eyes never leaving him. They didn't need to speak. They were the answer. They were the memories Thomas had buried, the guilt he couldn't face. They were the echoes of a life lost. The girl's face twisted as she grinned. "You never let us in before. You never let us remember." And then it clicked. It all clicked. His son, Sam. He wasn't real, not in the way he thought. Sam was a projection, a figment of his grief, a way for Thomas to hold on to something, to keep the memory of Emily alive. The knocks had started because Thomas hadn't wanted to face the truth. He hadn't wanted to face the loss, and the children, the hollow children, were here to force him to remember. They had always been here. Thomas woke up on the 6th night to silence. No knocking, no children standing in the doorway. The air was still and the room was warmer than it had been in days. He turned to look at Sam, but the bed was empty. Panicking, Thomas rushed to the other rooms, but the cabin was empty. Sam, was he gone? He heard a soft creak behind him and turned. There, standing in the doorway, were the children. They had always been there. "You didn't answer the knock," the girl whispered, her smile wide and empty. The world around Thomas cracked, like glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. Time unraveled. The cabin, the memories, everything was gone. When the local hermit came to check on the cabin weeks later, all he found was a broken mirror and 2 small dusty handprints on the table. There was no sign of Thomas Leary, no sign of Sam, just the echo of a knock, fading into the wind. Story number 4. Meredith had always dreamed of living in a quiet neighborhood, a place where she could raise her daughter, Ellie, in peace. After her divorce, she needed a fresh start, a place where the past couldn't follow her. So, when she found the small house at the end of Old Birch Street in the secluded cul-de-sac, she thought it was perfect. The house was older, a little worn, but it had character. The neighborhood was quiet, too. mostly elderly residents who kept to themselves. The kind of place where the leaves fell in waves and the air smelled like pine and autumn, but there was something about the street that felt off. A subtle unease Meredith couldn't quite place. The neighbors didn't talk much. They were polite enough, but their conversations were clipped, as if they didn't want to get too close. Meredith didn't mind. She was focused on Ellie. The 10-year-old girl was shy and quiet, often reading books or drawing in her sketchpad. Ellie had always been that way, but since the move, Meredith noticed a change. A subtle distance between them, like a quiet wall had risen between mother and daughter. Meredith chalked it up to the stress of moving. Ellie would adjust in time. It wasn't until Halloween that Meredith started to notice the oddness of the cul-de-sac. The kids had been excited for the night, their costumes ready and their pumpkins carved. Ellie had chosen to be a witch, a simple outfit with a pointy hat and a broomstick. Meredith had stocked up on candy, enough for the trick-or-treaters, though she wasn't sure how many would come. The street was so quiet, she thought. Maybe only a handful of kids would show. The first knock came at precisely 6 p.m. Meredith opened the door to find 4 children standing there. They were dressed in old-fashioned costumes, tattered cloaks, masks that looked almost too real, and eyes that were too bright, too empty. Meredith blinked, unsure if she'd seen right. They were children, but there was something unsettling about them, something that didn't quite fit. "Trick or treat," they said in unison, their voices too perfect, too synchronized. Meredith smiled, trying to shake off the unease. "Here you go," she said, handing them each a handful of candy. But then, out of instinct, she grabbed the full-sized candy bars from her stash and handed them over as well. The kids didn't say anything as they took the candy, but as they did, something shifted in the air. Meredith's heart skipped a beat. The silence in the room deepened, and the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. "Thank you," one of the children said, the voice soft and eerie. They turned to leave, but then there was a pause. And then, as if by magic, a 5th child appeared. He stood behind the others, quiet and still, as if he had been there all along but only just made himself visible. Meredith's eyes widened, but before she could say anything, the 4 children turned and walked down the path, the 5th one silently following them. They disappeared into the night, leaving Meredith standing in the doorway, confused and unsettled. The next morning, Meredith woke to find Ellie gone. Her daughter's bed was empty, the sheets tangled and cold. Panic seized her chest as she searched the house, calling Ellie's name over and over, but there was no answer. She was gone. A sick feeling crawled through her, a chill that seeped into her bones. She tried the phone, called her friends, but no one had seen Ellie. Desperate, Meredith ran outside, her eyes scanning the street. There was no sign of Ellie, no sign of anyone. But as she looked down the cul-de-sac, she saw something strange. At the far end of the street, standing alone in the yard of the old abandoned house, was a figure, a small figure. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. It was the 5th child, the one who had appeared last night. He was standing there, watching her with those empty eyes, his face hidden beneath a mask that seemed to shift in the sunlight. Suddenly, an old voice called out from behind her. "Don't follow him," Mr. Finn, the elderly neighbor warned, his face pale. "You don't know what you're doing." Meredith turned to him, desperate. "What do you mean? Where's Ellie? Where is she?" Mr. Finn stepped closer, his voice low and grim. "The children. They've been coming here every Halloween for as long as I can remember. 4 of them. They knock on doors. But the 5th child, he appears when someone gives them. More than they should. When someone welcomes them, he takes what they want. Who are they? Meredith asked, her voice trembling. They're not children, Mr. Finn whispered, glancing down the street. They're spirits, bound by a curse. Every year they come to collect souls in exchange for their freedom. Meredith's heart dropped. What do you mean, souls? Mr. Finn closed his eyes for a moment. The four, the children you saw, they aren't real. They're echoes. They've been cursed to walk this earth, bound to collect souls. When the fifth child appears, he takes someone. That someone becomes one of the four, and the cycle continues. Meredith felt the blood drain from her face. Ellie. She's gone. They took her. Mr. Finn nodded grimly. She's one of them now. The only way to stop it is to break the cycle, but there's no way to break it now. Not once the fifth child has come. That night, Meredith couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable. She heard the knocks again, 3 soft taps on the door. Then 2 more. Meredith tried to ignore it, but the door creaked open by itself, and in walked 4 children, their faces pale and empty, their eyes hollow. And behind them, standing silent and still, was the fifth child. Meredith didn't move. She couldn't. She could see the truth now. The fifth child was a part of them, part of the curse, part of the deal that had been made all those years ago. The children didn't need to speak. They didn't need to ask for anything. They only needed her to watch as Ellie, her daughter, walked into the room, now dressed in a tattered cloak, her eyes empty and blank. Meredith's heart shattered as Ellie looked at her, not with recognition, but with that same empty gaze the other children held. Ellie was gone. The next Halloween, the knocks came again. This time, when Meredith opened the door, 4 children stood there, Ellie among them. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile Meredith knew, and the fifth child, the one who had started it all, stood quietly behind them. The cycle had begun again. Story number 5. Zoe Kim had always been skeptical of things that went bump in the night. A paranormal vlogger by trade, she made a name for herself debunking urban legends and chasing down rumors about ghosts, curses, and haunted places. Her channel, Ghost Theory, had hundreds of thousands of subscribers, all waiting for her to prove or disprove whatever spooky tale was floating around that week. It was a business, a brand, and Zoe knew exactly how to sell it. But the story of the door had been different. It was one that made her skin crawl in ways she couldn't ignore. People in the city had been whispering about it for years. No one could pinpoint exactly where it appeared, but it was always in the same place. A crumbling alleyway tucked behind a row of abandoned stores. The door itself, old, ornate, and out of place. It wasn't just some forgotten entry to an old building. It was something else entirely, something alive. And anyone who knocked on it, they were never seen again. But that wasn't the part that intrigued Zoe. No, it was what came after. The eyes of the disappeared would start showing up. Strange, glassy eyes that didn't belong to anyone on Earth. The eyes would appear in mirrors, portraits, and even in video footage. No one knew where the door led, but it wasn't just the people who vanished. It was their identities. It was as if the door didn't just take them. It took who they were, piece by piece. Zoe, of course, wasn't buying it. "There's no way this is real," she told Marco, her editor, late one night while scrolling through the latest fan theories on her phone. "People love these kinds of stories. They see something strange. They make up a reason to explain it. I'm going to prove it. Her next live stream was scheduled to be all about the door. Zoe had already done some preliminary research, visited the alleyway, taken photos, talked to the people who swore they'd seen the door appear, only to find nothing. She had even interviewed a few survivors who claimed to have knocked and somehow escaped. Their stories were either shaky, confused, or so over the top that Zoe could practically see the embellishments happening in real time. Still, she knew her fans would eat it up, and if it all went according to plan, Zoe would debunk the legend once and for all. The night of the live stream came, and Zoe sat in front of her camera, her apartment lit by the soft glow of fairy lights and a few strategically placed lamps. She'd set up a series of cameras to cover every angle, just in case something strange happened. Her viewers flooded in, the chat scrolling by with comments and emojis. "Hey Zoe, you gonna finally prove the door's a hoax? Can't wait to see you ruin this one. I'm calling it, you'll debunk it in 10 minutes. But please, make it entertaining." Zoe grinned, leaning back in her chair, adjusting her mic. "Alright guys, tonight's the night. I'm going to go to the alley where the infamous door appears and show you just how much of a myth this really is. I've got my cameras set up and a flashlight. And let's be honest, it's probably going to be nothing but an old door. But if it's anything other than that, I'll be the first to admit it." She winked at the camera, and the chat erupted in excitement. Zoe made her way through the dim-lit streets of the city, the air thick with fog. The alley was just as everyone described, forgotten, grimy, and silent. The buildings on either side were covered in graffiti and peeling paint, and the trash in the gutters was long forgotten. There was a rustling sound from a pile of cardboard, boxes, but nothing out of the ordinary. She found the spot quickly, the empty space between the abandoned buildings where the door was said to appear. She set up her equipment, flashing her flashlight across the cobblestones. "Well, no door yet," Zoe said to her audience. "Looks like a regular old alleyway to me." But as she spoke, something caught the edge of her vision. There, at the far end of the alley, a shadow shifted. Zoe's heart skipped. Was it a trick of the light? The shadows were long in the fog, after all. But when she turned her camera, there it was, the door. It wasn't there before. The door stood against the crumbling brick, an ancient wooden thing, thick with carvings and a tarnished brass handle. The sight of it made Zoe's stomach lurch. She had expected some kind of prank, some elaborate hoax. But this was real. The chat was going wild. "Oh my God, Zoe, is that the door? No way. Is this actually happening right now? Zoe, don't knock on it. It's real." Zoe swallowed. She had to be rational. She had to prove this was a trick. "All right, guys, here it is. The infamous door. I'm going to knock on it and show you it's just an old door. Nothing special. Don't panic." The sound of her knuckles against the wood echoed in the alley, loud and hollow. Nothing happened at first. Then the door creaked open, just a little as if inviting her in. A chill ran down Zoe's spine. Her hands shook as she held the camera up, showing her viewers what was now beyond the door. It was a black void. A swirling, infinite darkness that seemed to stretch beyond the very fabric of reality. Suddenly, she heard something. Voices, whispers. The whispers were soft, indistinct, but there was something wrong about them. Something alive about them. "Zoe, get out of there." Marco's voice crackled through her earpiece, urgent and panicked. "It's not safe. Turn around." But Zoe didn't hear him. She stepped closer to the door, the emptiness drawing her in like a magnet. Her hand trembled as she reached out, fingers brushing the dark. The moment her hand touched the void, a sharp pain shot through her body. Her breath caught and her vision blurred. She felt herself falling, as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Everything went black. When Zoe awoke, she wasn't in the alley anymore. She was in a room, an old, decrepit room that mirrored her own apartment. The walls were peeling, the furniture aged and cracked. But the strangest thing was the mirror across the room, reflecting her every movement. And then she saw it. The mirror showed her, not as she was, but as someone else. Her face was distorted, a strange mask of her features. Her eyes, they weren't hers. They were cold, empty, like the eyes of those who had vanished before her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers returned, louder now, coming from the mirror, from the walls, from the very air. And then the live stream continued. Her viewers flooded the chat. "Zoe, is this real? What's happening? Zoe, talk to us, please." But it wasn't Zoe who answered. It wasn't her voice that came through the mic, but something else. A voice that wasn't hers. Cold, hollow. "I am Zoe," it whispered as her fingers moved on their own, typing in the chat. "I am Zoe." But it wasn't, and it never would be again. As the live stream played on, the door closed behind her. The room faded into darkness. And somewhere, in another world that mimicked her own, a knock echoed. Story number 6. Lena Patel had never been one to believe in the supernatural. A practical woman, a mother of 2, and a skeptic at heart, she dismissed the ghost stories and old superstitions that so many people seem to cling to. Her family had just moved to the small secluded village of Hollowbrook, a quiet place tucked away in the hills, far from the noise of the city. It was the kind of place where life slowed down, and people didn't ask too many questions about your past. Perfect for Lena, Ashwin, and their 2 young children, Maya and Dev. The village was picturesque, with cobblestone streets, old stone houses, and a sense of history that felt both comforting and a little eerie. But there was one thing about Hollowbrook that unsettled Lena: the old tales. There were whispers about the children of the village, the ones who knocked at doors after dusk and whispered, "You've been invited." The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, warning newcomers like Lena not to engage with the children, not to answer the knocks. Old Lady Bram, the village elder, had even pulled Lena aside when they first arrived. "Listen, dear," she had said, her voice shaking like dry leaves in the wind. "You've got children. Don't let them play with the others. And if the knocking comes, don't open the door. You've been warned. It's not what it seems." Lena had smiled politely, dismissing the old woman's warning as nothing more than the ramblings of someone who'd spent too many years alone. But as the days went by, the stories stuck in her mind, like little splinters under her skin. It was the 3rd evening after they'd moved in when it happened. The house was quiet, the kids were asleep, and Ashwin was in the living room, tinkering with some old furniture. Lena was washing the dishes, her hands lost in the soapy water when she heard it. A knock at the door. 3 soft raps, followed by the quietest pause. She felt it, like the world had stopped for just a moment. Her first instinct was to ignore it. But then came the whisper. It was soft at first, almost a breath. A voice, childish, sweet, but strange. "You've been invited." Lena froze, a cold chill crawling up her spine. The voice wasn't one of her children. She glanced at the clock. It was well past sunset. The village was peaceful, almost too peaceful. A few birds chirped in the distance, but otherwise, nothing moved. The knocking came again. This time, Lena couldn't ignore it. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door. Her curiosity got the better of her. She hadn't been in this small town long enough to know the children, but the warning, old Lady Bram's warning, echoed in her mind. Still, something inside her tugged her forward. She opened the door. Standing on the porch were 3 children. Their faces were pale, their eyes large and wide, like they had seen too much for their young years. Their clothes were old-fashioned, too neat, as if they'd been dressed up for some forgotten occasion. "We've come for you," the child in the middle said, their voice echoing in a way that didn't quite match the sound. "You've been invited." Lena's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced, but her mouth spoke without her permission. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaking. The children smiled in unison, and it was a smile that made her stomach twist. It was like something ancient and knowing had taken root in their faces. "You've been invited," they repeated. "Come with us." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back from the door, trying to shut it, but the child's hand shot out cold as ice, blocking it from closing. Lena's mind screamed at her to turn and run, but her body moved before she could stop it. She stepped outside, the cool evening air biting at her skin. The children turned and began walking, their small feet soundless on the grass. Without thinking, Lena followed them. The world around her seemed to shift as she walked. The village, the familiar streets, the houses, everything began to fade. The trees, once so real, turned into shadows, stretching longer and longer, bending in ways that defied physics. The houses became blurry, like memories of a place she'd never been. Then the landscape completely changed. The trees were gone, replaced by rolling fields of tall grass, their tips golden against a sky that was far too bright, far too perfect. The air smelled sweet, like summer mornings that lasted forever. Everything was peaceful, silent, beautiful. And then she saw them. Hundreds of children standing in the fields, smiling, their faces all pale, their eyes wide and strange. They were all looking at her, waiting. "You've been invited," they said in unison, their voices soft and haunting. And for a moment, just a moment, Lena felt something shift inside her, something gentle, something warm, that made her forget the warnings, the fear. The children were all around her now, and she smiled back. She didn't know why, but it felt right. "You'll play with us," one of the children whispered, and Lena, without thinking, nodded. The next morning, Lena woke up in her own bed. She was disoriented, her body heavy, like she had been asleep for days. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room. The sunlight streamed in through the curtains, but it felt wrong. Too bright, too perfect. She rushed to the window and looked out. The village was gone. The quiet streets, the familiar houses, all vanished. Instead, there was a wide expanse of green fields stretching out before her. And there, in the distance, stood the children. They were all staring at her, waiting. Then Lena heard it. A soft whisper. "You've been invited." Her eyes widened in realization. The children, they weren't just playing. They had taken her. She was no longer in her world. She had crossed into theirs. A world where time didn't matter, where children ruled and adults were forgotten. Suddenly, Lena felt a pull in her chest, a force that wanted to forget everything. Her past, her family, her life. she felt it creeping in like a fog, filling her mind with softness, with innocence, with forgetting. Her children, Maya and Dev, were nowhere to be seen. Her thoughts felt clouded, but for some reason she didn't mind. She was happy here, in this world of children, where nothing was expected and everything was play. Lena giggled. It felt strange at first, but then it felt good. It felt freeing, and as the days went by, her laughter grew louder. She played with the other children, danced in the fields, and forgot what it was like to be an adult. She forgot about Ashwin, about the village, about her life. She didn't even remember her name anymore. One by one, the adults who had crossed over before her faded too. They became as empty as the world around them. Lena laughed and played, and when someone asked her name, she smiled a little too wide. "I've been invited," she said, and that was all that mattered. Story number 7. The storm came fast, rolling in like a tidal wave, crashing against the town of Briar Ridge with a fury that sent tree branches snapping and windows rattling. By the time the lightning had stopped flashing and the thunder had faded into a distant growl, Briar Ridge was plunged into darkness. The power was out and the town was silent, save for the occasional gust of wind rattling the shutters of the old houses. Leonard Griggs had been sitting in his armchair, the only light coming from a solitary candle flickering on the table beside him. The storm had brought him no comfort, only a reminder of the things he'd seen, the things he'd done. As a blind war veteran, he'd grown accustomed to the dark, but the kind of dark that the storm had brought, deep and oppressive, felt different. His instincts, honed by years of service and survival, told him something was off. He heard the first knock just after the storm cleared. It was a soft tap, tap, tap at the door, followed by a faint voice. "Do you want to play?" At first, Leonard thought it was a trick. A couple of kids from the neighborhood, probably, messing around in the aftermath of the storm. He had learned long ago not to trust his ears in the darkness. But this voice, there was something strange about it. Something wrong. Another knock. "Do you want to play?" Leonard stood up, his cane tapping gently against the wooden floor. He moved slowly toward the door, a wariness creeping up his spine. He was a veteran. He had been through hell and back. He wasn't the kind of man who would let some curious kids cause him trouble. But this felt different. His hand brushed the doorframe as he reached for the handle, but before he could open it, he heard footsteps scurrying away into the street, fading into the silence of the dark night. The next day, Leonard found his neighbor, Dana, standing on her porch. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear them?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The kids?" Leonard asked, his face unchanging. "Yeah, I heard them." "They came to my door, too," Dana said, her breath shaky. I didn't answer, but then I heard others, all over the street, the knock, the voice." Leonard's mind clicked into gear. It wasn't the kids causing trouble. There was something else at play, something far older than any child. He had been through too much in his life to ignore the feeling in his gut. "How many did you hear?" he asked. "I don't know," Dana said, her voice quiet. "Dozens, maybe more, and they're still out there." Leonard stood still for a moment, listening, his sharp hearing picking up faint sounds, the scurrying footsteps of children running through the streets, the occasional voice echoing from the distance. "Do you want to play?" they whispered, again and again. That night, Leonard sat by his window, his fingers grazing the edges of his cane. The whole town was in silence, save for the occasional distant whisper. He knew something wasn't right. He could feel it in the air, in the way the shadows twisted outside his window, in the way the breeze was still, like the calm before a storm. Then came the knock. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, Leonard didn't wait for the voice. He opened the door quickly, his cane raised in defense. Standing in the doorway was a small group of children, their faces blank, their eyes wide with something hollow, something empty. They looked normal, too normal. Their clothes were neat, clean, and they stood in perfect formation, staring at him, unblinking. "Do you want to play?" one of them asked, its voice a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed. Leonard's senses sharpened. There was something wrong with their voices. It wasn't like a child's voice at all. It was an unnatural thing, a sound that seemed to press into his mind, trying to pull him in. He resisted, clenching his fists. "No," he said firmly, his voice low, almost a growl. "I don't want to play." But the children didn't move. They just stood there, their eyes boring into him, unblinking. Something inside Leonard shifted. His war instincts, the part of him that had kept him alive through the darkest moments of his life, told him that these were no ordinary kids. They were something worse, something that fed on attention, that fed on the power of presence. They weren't asking to play. They were asking for something else. "Go away," he said again, louder this time. But the children remained. The next morning, Dana was gone. Her house was dark. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. Leonard didn't need to ask. He knew. The children had taken her. His suspicion was confirmed when he found Todd, a boy who lived a few houses down. Todd had been found wandering the streets, his face pale, his eyes wide in terror. He was no longer the same boy Leonard had once known. The light in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by something hollow and empty. "Where's your mother, Todd?" Leonard asked, kneeling down to meet his gaze. Todd didn't respond at first. Then he whispered, "They came for her. They said she wanted to play." Leonard stood up, his fists clenched. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. Not to anyone else on the street. He had to stop this. For the next few days, Leonard kept watch. The children came every evening, knocking on doors, asking the same question. "Do you want to play?" And one by one, the people of the street disappeared, leaving only silence in their wake. But Leonard wasn't going to be one of them. He had fought in wars. He had survived battles no man should have to face. This was no different. Then, on the fifth night, Leonard finally understood what the children were. They weren't kids at all. They were ancient things, parasitic, entities that thrived on the attention and the innocence of adults. They were eldritch creatures, using the form of children to trick people into letting them in. Once invited, they would feed on the person's essence, devouring them piece by piece until there was nothing left but a shell. But Leonard knew how to fight. His blindness, the one thing he had cursed for so long, was the very thing that kept him safe. He couldn't see their eyes, couldn't fall victim to their hypnotic gaze. He had an advantage now. When the children came again that night, he was ready. They knocked. Tap, tap, tap. "Do you want to play?" they asked in unison. Leonard opened the door. He heard their whispers, felt their presence, but he didn't look into their eyes. He couldn't afford to. Instead, he swung his cane, sweeping it through the air in front of him. He knew the force. Of their gaze was their weapon, their power. He wouldn't give them that power. But as he struck, something cracked. Something inside the children splintered. The ground trembled and the air grew thick with an unnatural, suffocating pressure. The children screamed, their voices changing, distorting, as something darker, something worse, tried to claw its way out from within them. Leonard's heart pounded as the sky above split open with thunder, and the darkness that had been contained in the children poured out into the world. What he had freed was something far worse than the parasites that had once been children. Something ancient, something hungry, that had been trapped for centuries. But Leonard couldn't stop it now. His victory had come at a terrible price. As the town of Briar Ridge crumbled around him, Leonard stood alone, his senses alert to the chaos that had been unleashed. The children were gone, but something else remained, and now it was hungry for more. Story number 8. The apartment building on Ashwood Street had long been condemned, but it still stood. The windows were boarded up, the doors chained shut, and the walls, once painted with care, now sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Yet, despite the rotting infrastructure, the building was far from empty. Whispers of the dead filled the air. Echoes of the past clung to the peeling walls like a memory that never quite left. Daria Owens had heard the stories. She had heard them from people who lived nearby, from those who had been brave or foolish enough to go near the building after dark. They spoke of knocks at the door, soft but insistent, followed by the chilling voices of children calling out for their names. Raheem. Come play with us, Raheem. A child's voice echoed down the hallways, only to be followed by another. Sarah. Come find me, Sarah. They were voices that shouldn't have been there. Children's voices, trapped in the walls of a building that had seen its fair share of tragedy. A fire had gutted the building years ago, and with it, the lives of several children who had never been found. Their bodies had never been recovered. The cause of the fire had never been determined, but the neighborhood still talked about it in hushed tones. As a social worker, Daria had heard her share of strange stories, but this one lingered in her mind more than the rest. The idea that children who had vanished, were still trying to reach out, still trying to find those who had ignored their cries, she couldn't help but feel a pull, an unshakable need to investigate. Daria had grown up in that very building. She had lived there with her parents, her younger brother, and a few other families. She had spent most of her childhood in that worn-down place, where the air always smelled of damp wood and old carpets. But there was something she didn't remember, something she had forced herself to forget. The fire. She didn't know why she had blocked the memory. It was a memory she'd buried deep, like a box locked in a dark attic. She remembered the smoke, the screams, and the feeling of being pulled away, her hand tightly gripped by someone she trusted. But the details beyond that were hazy, lost in the fog of time. It wasn't until Daria took the case that the memories began to resurface. She had no idea why she had been drawn to investigate a building she had once called home. But as she walked through the darkened halls again, a wave of familiarity washed over her. The floor creaked beneath her feet. The smell of dust and mildew choked her throat. Her first stop was the caretaker's apartment, the one place she knew she could get answers. Mr. Collins had lived there for as long as she could remember. He was an old man then, and now, decades later, his frailty had only grown. He'd never left the building, even after the fire. When she knocked, Mr. Collins answered, his wrinkled face pale. his eyes dull. "You shouldn't be here, Daria," he said, his voice cracking with fear. "None of us should be." "Why, Mr. Collins?" Daria asked, stepping inside. "Why are people still hearing the children's voices?" He looked around nervously before he closed the door behind her. "I knew them, Daria," he said, his voice shaking. "The kids. I was supposed to keep them safe. But when the fire came, I locked them in." Daria's heart stopped. The words hit her like a slap. "What do you mean, you locked them in?" "They were in the playroom," Mr. Collins whispered, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I thought it would keep them safe. The fire was spreading, and I thought if I locked the door, they'd be okay. I thought it would save them, but it didn't. They didn't make it out, and He stopped, tears gathering in his eyes. "I never told anyone. I never told anyone that they were trapped." Daria stepped back, her chest tightening. "Mr. Collins, I didn't mean to," he cried, his hands trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. They're still here, trapped, calling for help." That night, Daria returned to the building. She had to find the room, the playroom where the children had been locked away. She had to face the truth, even if it meant confronting the terror she had buried for so long. The building was eerily silent as she made her way to the farthest hallway. It was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of her flashlight. The walls seemed to close in on her as she walked, and she could almost hear the whispers again, soft, pleading voices. "Daria, help us." Her name. They were calling her name. She stopped in front of the door. The room beyond was locked, but she remembered something. A key. A rusted key she had found when she was a child, hidden in her room. She still had it, deep in her pocket. She didn't know why she kept it. But now, as her fingers closed around it, she realized the truth. It had always been for this moment. The door creaked open, revealing a room that seemed frozen in time. Dust hung in the air, and the remnants of old toys lay scattered across the floor. The walls were charred, blackened from the fire, but nothing could erase the memories that lingered. And then she saw them. The children. Their forms flickered like smoke, transparent but real enough to see. They were the same children who had knocked on doors, who had whispered their names. But now, they were no longer asking. They were demanding. Their eyes were wide with desperation, their mouths open in silent screams. "You left us," one of them said, her voice hollow and echoing in Daria's mind. "You heard our cries, and you didn't come." Daria felt a surge of guilt and horror rush through her. She had forgotten. She had been one of the children who had escaped, and she had left them behind. "No," she whispered. "I didn't. No, I didn't." But the children weren't listening. Their faces contorted with pain, and their hands reached out, desperate to drag her into the fire, into the ashes. Suddenly, the walls seemed to close in, the air thickening, the temperature rising as the flames of the past seemed to return. The children began to chant, their voices rising in unison. "You will join us. You will burn with us." Daria knew what she had to do. She had to stay behind. She had to make it right. The children couldn't be left in this endless cycle of torment. She had to give them peace, even if it meant sacrificing herself. She stepped forward into the center of the room and closed her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The room erupted into heat and smoke as the flames of the past roared to life. Daria's body was consumed by the fire, but her soul was free. She could feel the children's whispers fade, their pain finally gone. The next day, the building collapsed. When the authorities arrived, there was nothing left, just rubble. And in the dust, there were no more knocks, no more voices. But as they turned to leave, one of them, Sheriff Marlowe, stopped. He heard it, a soft knock, a whisper. "Daria, help us." The voice was faint, but it was there, and then, in the silence that followed, a voice that wasn't Daria's, but still familiar, whispered, "Do you want to play? Story number 9. Elijah Moore had never believed in the strange, the unexplained. He was a practical man, an accountant, precise, meticulous, and rooted firmly in the everyday world. But all that changed when his daughter Ava turned 10. It was a quiet Sunday when it happened. Elijah had just finished breakfast, wiping crumbs from his hands when Ava came running into the kitchen. She was laughing, holding something in her hands. "Dad, look what I found in my room," she said, her eyes wide with excitement. She held up a small wooden door, no bigger than a piece of a dollhouse, but intricately carved with symbols Elijah didn't recognize. The wood was smooth but old, the color a rich, dark brown. Elijah frowned. "Where did you get that?" "I don't know," Ava replied, her voice tinged with that mixture of excitement and confusion that only children could muster. "It just appeared there, after my party. I thought it was for me." She smiled, but Elijah could tell something about her smile was a little off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Ava was getting ready for bed, Elijah noticed something strange. A low, rhythmic sound, like a knock, came from the other side of the door. The noise was soft but persistent. A steady tap, tap, tap. His heart raced as he approached the door, the one that had appeared so suddenly in Ava's room. Ava was asleep in her bed, her back to the wall. The knock continued, gentle but unyielding. Elijah hesitated before reaching for the doorknob. "Ava," he whispered, "did you hear that?" No answer, just the tap, tap, tap. He opened the door. There was nothing on the other side but darkness, and then, without warning, the air grew cold. The knock stopped. Ava's soft breathing could still be heard from her bed, but the unease Elijah felt deepened. He closed the door, the feeling of dread curling in his stomach, but something lingered. He could feel it, like a presence in the room. That night, Ava disappeared. Elijah woke to the silence of an empty house. Ava was gone. The door to her room was wide open, the strange wooden door standing there, innocent as ever, in the middle of the room. Panicked, Elijah called out for her. He checked every corner of the house. He rushed through the streets, asking anyone he could find if they'd seen her, but no one had. Ava was simply gone. The police were called, but there were no leads, no clues. It was as if Ava had vanished into thin air. But that was just the beginning. A week later, Elijah was sifting through old family photos, trying to keep his mind busy, when something stopped him cold. He was flipping through pictures of her birthday party, when his eyes landed on one in particular, a shot of him and Ava smiling in front of the cake. But in the background of the photo, standing in the far corner, was a shadowy figure. Ava. But it wasn't the Ava he knew. It was as if she was out of place. Her smile was wrong, and she looked older somehow. Elijah's pulse quickened. He grabbed another picture from a different angle, taken with the same camera but moments later. And again, in the background, Ava. But now, she was even farther away, more out of focus. It was as if she wasn't really there at all. He dropped the photos, his mind spinning. Where had she gone? What was that door? Why had she vanished like that? Desperate, Elijah turned to his old friend Cam, a tech-savvy investigator who loved solving puzzles no one else could. Cam had been Elijah's rock for years, and now, in this nightmare, he needed his help more than ever. "I need you to dig into something for me," Elijah said, pacing around his kitchen. "It's about that damn door." Cam raised an eyebrow. "What door?" "Elijah," Lydia said from the doorway, her voice a mixture of concern and anger. "Stop. You need to let this go. Ava's gone." "I can't just let it go," Elijah snapped, his voice hoarse. "She's not gone. She's somewhere, and I have to find her. It's that damn door, Lydia." Lydia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't care what you think, Elijah. That door is not real. Ava's gone. You need to—" "Elijah, listen to me," Cam interrupted, holding up his phone. "I found something. You're right. That door, it's not just some weird coincidence. It's a symbol, an ancient one." "Ancient?" Elijah asked, narrowing his eyes. "What do you mean?" "It's a cult," Cam said, his voice heavy. "The custodians. They believe in something called the exchange, trading innocence for time. They've been doing it for centuries. They use those doors to lure children, and when they answer, they take their souls. The children vanish. They're never really gone, though. They live on in photos, memories like shadows, until they fade completely." Elijah stood frozen. His throat tightened. "And Ava?" "I'm sorry, man," Cam said softly. "Ava's one of them now. But there's a way to stop this. The door, it's a portal, and you can go to the other side. Try to open it, break the cycle, but you'll have to give up everything to do it." Elijah didn't hesitate. He went to the door. It had appeared again, just as it had on Ava's birthday, right there in the middle of her room. He opened it, stepping through the threshold into a world that didn't make sense. Everything was dark, twisted. He could hear whispers, faint echoes of children calling his name. He stumbled forward, heart pounding, until he saw it. There, in the distance, was Ava, standing in a room that looked like it belonged to another time. She was older now, her face unfamiliar, her eyes distant. But it was her. "Ava," he called out, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. "Ava, please come back." She didn't move. The door in the far corner of the room slowly creaked open, and as it did, the whispers grew louder. Then he saw them. The custodians. Timeless beings. Their faces hidden beneath hoods. Their presence an overwhelming weight. They were the ones who controlled the doors, feeding on the lives they took. "You've come to take her back?" one of them asked, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "Do you think you can undo what has been done?" Elijah's heart broke. "Please," he said, falling to his knees. "I'll do anything. Just give her back." The custodian tilted its head, studying him. "You can take her place. You can exchange your soul for hers, or you can let her go. The door will close, but you will never see her again. Not in this life." Elijah's chest tightened. He thought of his daughter, of her smile, of the years they had left together. But the truth was, he couldn't keep her. Not in this world. Not with the price the custodians demanded. He turned away. "I'll let her go." The door closed behind him. Days later, Elijah stood in his living room holding a photo in his hands. It was of him, Lydia, and Ava. Taken just before her 10th birthday, it was the last picture they had together. In the background, just barely visible, was Ava, standing there smiling, her eyes filled with something Elijah hadn't noticed before: peace. And somewhere in the depths of his heart, he knew it was her final smile, a gift she had left behind for him. The door was gone. But in the corner of the photo, there was one more thing: a soft knock. Story number 10. Maxine Hale had always been a woman of logic. A meteorologist who prided herself on understanding the weather, she had a mind for data, patterns, and the solid science behind each storm. For years, she had weathered the unpredictable nature of the world's skies, finding comfort in the predictable and the known. But this was something else. It started with the rain. It always started with the rain. For days, the sky had been nothing but an unbroken sheet of gray, the air thick with moisture, the wind pulling in tight gusts, and the rain, endless, relentless, fell in sheets that never seemed to stop. What had once been a passing storm turned into something far more ominous, stretching out into days, then weeks. People in the small town of Ashbury began to whisper about it, about the endless rain and the strange children who appeared at their doors. Maxine hadn't paid much attention at first. She was too focused on the numbers. The barometric pressure was unusual, that was true. The atmospheric conditions were shifting in ways that didn't make sense. But what truly caught her attention was the reports from the locals. Children, pale, drenched to the bone, knocking on doors. The first report had come from Mrs. Caldwell, the mayor's wife. They were just standing there, she said, voice trembling when Maxine had spoken with her. Little things, all wet. They looked like they were crying, but no sound came out. When I opened the door to let them in, they just stared at me. I don't know what happened after that. It wasn't long before others started to report the same thing. And each time someone let the children in, something awful happened. People fell into comas, deep, unshakable comas, their bodies trapped in a state of eternal sleep while their minds wandered endlessly, caught in dreams no one could understand. Maxine sat at her desk, staring at the data in front of her. There were patterns, but they didn't add up. Rain was falling at an impossible rate. The weather anomalies couldn't be explained by typical causes like cold fronts or warm water currents. This wasn't a normal storm. Her assistant, Theo, stood beside her, nervously glancing at the reports. Maxine, you've seen the photos. The children. They look like they're not even human. They are human, she said firmly, tapping the screen. They're just children, wet and disoriented. They might be suffering from exposure. That's all. But even as she said the words, something in her gut twisted. She had seen the photographs. The children's eyes, black and lifeless, staring through the camera lens with a hollow alien gaze. The knocking continued. Every night the rain pounded the town, and every night the children came. They knocked on doors, appearing from the storm like apparitions. And every time someone opened the door, someone fell into a coma. Maxine couldn't ignore it any longer. She needed answers. She made an appointment with Dr. Wren, a folklorist she had worked with in the past. The man was eccentric, but his knowledge of the region's history and ancient myths was invaluable. When she asked him about the rain, he went quiet for a long time. "You're dealing with something far older than any storm," he said finally, his eyes distant. "Have you heard the old stories about the flood?" Maxine raised an eyebrow. "Flood myths? From where?" From here, this town, long before it, was a town. Dr. Wren leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The Rain-born, children of the storm. They come to collect, to take what they need. Innocence, time, souls. They are the messengers of something far darker, something that has waited for centuries. Maxine frowned. You mean, you think this storm is alive? Dr. Wren nodded. Yes, and it's no accident. The rain is the vessel. It isn't just water. It is alive. It is feeding. And it uses the children to do its bidding. That night, Maxine couldn't sleep. Her mind kept spinning with what Dr. Wren had said. If the rain was alive, if the children were its messengers, then what did it want? And why now? She went to the window, staring out at the relentless downpour. The world outside was drowned in water, the streets flooding, the power lines buzzing with electricity, the trees bent by the wind. In the distance, she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement in the rain. A child standing alone in the storm. Maxine's heart raced. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, Theo following closely behind. They found the child at the edge of a town, standing in the middle of the flooded street, soaked to the bone. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She was staring at nothing, lost in the storm. Maxine approached cautiously, crouching in front of the girl. Hey, she said softly. Are you okay? Where are your parents? The child didn't answer. Instead, she lifted her head and spoke in a voice that wasn't hers, but familiar. You've been invited. Maxine's blood ran cold. The words were the same as the others had reported, and then the girl raised her hand as though beckoning her forward. Maxine recoiled. No, I won't let you in. But before she could turn away, a deafening roar of thunder echoed through the sky, and the rain began to pour harder, faster, unnaturally. So, suddenly she felt an unnatural pressure in her chest, a weight pulling at her soul, like the storm itself was trying to force its way inside her. She stumbled back, but Theo grabbed her arm. We have to go, Theo shouted, his voice strained. It's not just the rain, Maxine. It's them, the children, the storm. It's all part of it. We need to stop this. Maxine knew Theo was right. They couldn't wait any longer. The rain, the children, the comas, it all pointed to the same thing. But what could she do? Then the idea came to her. Dr. Wren had said the rain was a vessel, and it used dreams to terraform the waking world. If that was true, then maybe, just maybe, she could trap it. If she could get inside the dream. Maxine found herself standing at the edge of the town's cemetery, where the grave markers were half submerged in water. The rain was no longer just falling. It was rising, the ground itself beginning to flood. Maxine knew what she had to do. She had to let the rain take her, enter the dream realm and fight it from the inside. Maxine, no, Theo cried, grabbing her wrist. You can't. But Maxine had already made up her mind. She stepped into the storm, the rain seeping into her skin, into her bones. And in that moment, the world around her melted away, like mist dissolving in the sun. She fell deeper and deeper into a realm of endless rain and shadow. In the dream, Maxine found herself standing on the shores of an endless ocean. The sky was dark, a swirling mass of clouds that seemed to stretch forever. The children were there, staring at her, their eyes filled with empty hunger. You've come, they whispered. Now, you will stay. Maxine took a deep breath. She knew she couldn't fight them all. But there was one thing she could do. "I'm not leaving until this is over," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. With a wave of her hand, she called forth the storm, and in the dream realm, she did what had to be done. She trapped the entity, the Rainborn, in a cage of water, a prison of endless rain. The storm outside began to quiet, the downpour fading away, the rain finally stopping. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The skies were clear, the town eerily calm. But Maxine knew the truth. The storm wasn't gone. It was still out there, waiting. And the next forecast? Rain. Starting tomorrow. And in the final photo Maxine took just before she left the storms, grasp, there was a shadow in the corner. One of the children, smiling faintly. Still waiting. If you're brave enough, hit play. Subscribe, like, and share before the knocking starts. Drop a comment. Which child would you let in? And which one would you run from? Don't forget to lock your doors tonight.